You watched a lot of this, so we're all going to sort of put forward our two takeaways from the weekend after all those speeches and all the politicking. So first, one of your takeaways is that there's no front runner in the primary, right?
I think there's no obvious one, which is a little unusual for the Republican Party this close in, but I think you can make a plausible case for any one of 4 or 5 people, and I think it's probably not going to change for a good long time.
What does that mean in New Hampshire, Tom, to have a big, huge field with no obvious front runner? What does that change the dynamics from how things normally are in your state?
Well, I think it changes a lot in terms of how you put programs together. It certainly is a full employment period for a lot of Republican operatives, and I think it creates New Hampshire as a really populistic kind of battleground where you can really do a lot of one-on-one retail politicking. There's going to be a lot of that because that's one way to cut through the clutter right now.
And Tom, you're not for anybody at this point, right? Just to be clear, you're not supporting any of the candidates. You're not. All right. So
no, I'm from John Farrell and the Boston Red Sox.
I assume your list of people who could win the primary at this point is Jeb Bush, Scott Walker, Rand Paul, Christie, yes or no? Rubio, yes or no?
Christie, Rubio, yeah. I would, if he gets in, I would put Kasich in that list too.
So that's 6. So again, the traditional dynamic is somebody's ahead. Is there a way for somebody to pull ahead in a meaningful way at this point until the end, or are we going to be like this all the way through?
I think we'll stay in this vein probably, certainly through the fall, unless something major happens where someone, a portion of the field collapses and leaving in that bracket just 1 or 2 people.
Right.
I think as long as we're like in the field of 64, there's too many things that can happen still.
Right. All right. So one of my takeaways was about Marco Rubio. As good a speaker as he is, the speech he gave up in New Hampshire, he did the Friday night dinner speech, was actually better, even according to some of his supporters, than his announcement speech, which was pretty well received. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
The 21st century can be an American century if we want it to be. Now it is up to you and I to go out and to seize it, to be the party of the future, to show those who are trying to improve their lives that we are the party with the ideas and the plan to get us there. And if we do these things, then we will be able to leave for our children what Americans always leave for their children, the single greatest nation in the history of all mankind.
There's just a flavor, Tom, of just how good he was. How far can a guy giving a good stump speech in this field, in this heat race, how far can that carry him?
Well, it can get him pretty far in, but beyond the stump speech, beyond what he actually talks about, he projects a commitment, if I can use an old term, an authenticity, that quite beyond the sort of stylistic part of what he does, the way he does it and the way people react to it is very genuine. And beyond the rhetoric, there's a comfort level that he develops that's impressive, and he comes across as willing to serve but not trying to grasp. And I think that's a very good thing.
Tom, if you put aside what Rubio is saying, and you put aside, in terms of policy or substance, and you put aside his communication skills, you have a basic thrust of his campaign, which is generational. He's very explicit about that. He's basically saying to people, Jeb Bush is a bad candidate to run against Hillary Clinton. We must look like the future. I look like the future. Get behind me. Is that an argument that cuts ice in New Hampshire?
I don't think he necessarily says Jeb Bush is a bad candidate.
No.
I think he says
he looks
this
like
is
the
a
past.
time to make a generational change.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think he names names, but I think he's talking about generational change. All right. And our party is ready for it. I think we need to talk about where our party goes and what the future is, and especially where, frankly, the Democrats are likely to run someone of another generation who's significantly older and been part of the public scene for a lot longer.
All right, John, one of your takeaways is about John Kasich.
Well, I mean, look, John Kasich, as we know, made some moves last week to move a little closer to running. He moved even closer up at the event that you were at in New Hampshire. We're going to take a listen to that right now. This is what John Kasich had to say in New Hampshire, kind of tip his hand a little bit.
At the end of the day, if I feel this is my call, I will come back again and again and again. And in the meantime, I'm not going to change my message. So think about me, would you? Don't commit too soon. Let us all have a chance to breathe and get out. And you know what I really look forward to? Being out in your homes again. Letting you get to know me and see me. That's what it's really all about.
So So I think we have a sense that Kasich is getting closer to running. He's not absolutely certainly going to get in, but he's making moves to get himself ready to go. And it just, part of what I'll ask Tom about this in a second, but it just says to me that this establishment bracket, is there's a big crowd in the anti-establishment grassroots bracket. The establishment bracket has been a little bit more limited. Kasich getting in really gives you a sense of the level of competition that a guy like Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Scott Walker are going to face. Tom, what do you think about that? Talk about both the establishment bracket, number one, and more specifically about John Kasich. We all know a lot of people who think John Kasich could be a real player in this if he gets in.
Yeah, I think the center-right bracket, you call it establishment, I'll call it center-right, is filling up. And because, by the way, that's the part of the party that usually the nominee comes from, and it's the part of the party that usually does well in New Hampshire, particularly in a year in which a lot of independents are going to take Republican ballots, and that's where they would tend to go. I think Kasich's one of the most interesting fellows coming out of this weekend. And we were reference to what Hillary Clinton talks about mental health and drug addiction. He talks about those things, too. Yeah. And he talks about them in a very human, personal way. I think he expands the dialogue. He would make a great addition to this field.
All right, Tom, another one of your takeaways was that the Hillary Clinton is serving to unite the Republican field. Let's listen to Lindsey Graham on that.
At the end of the day, folks, the Republican Party's got a chance of a lifetime. If she wins, when are we ever going to win again? So if it's not me, for God's sakes, pick somebody that can win.
Tom, it seems to me while there's some Republicans who think she'll be easy to beat if she's a Democratic nominee, most people up in New Hampshire I talk to think she'll be formidable as a fundraiser and because of the Electoral College. So doesn't that help people who can make an electability argument more like a Bush or a Kasich than it does somebody like a Cruz?
I think you're exactly right. I mean, I call this the game of 270. And somebody's going to have to make the argument about how do you get to 270 electoral votes? How do you get votes that we've been losing, states we've been losing, into the Republican column? Somebody from Ohio, somebody from Pennsylvania, some of those places where we need to get those states to move our way, or from Florida, we need to move those people our way. I think they have a good chance. And I think because Hillary Clinton is so firmly established as the Democratic nominee, she's going to really crystallize that question of electability and make it absolutely central to the Republican debate.
Tom, a lot of Republicans up there in New Hampshire spent a lot of time attacking Hillary Clinton. Do you think there is any risk at all for the party that it will spend too much time focused on her before it has its own nominee?
It's a funny time up here. You don't want to be too negative. You've got to start talking about what you can do. But you really don't know whether it makes sense to continue to go after President Obama, whose star is in the descendancy, or to go after Hillary Clinton, who you're going to run against. Somebody's going to strike the right balance, and somebody will be able to marry those two things. So we're running against what's in place. This is going to be a change election, and Hillary Clinton cannot be allowed to represent change.
Yeah, I think the smarter attacks are the ones that don't go after her personally, but maybe that's just me. All right, John, your other big takeaway was about a guy who I rated in my very scientific report cards as one of the best 4 or 5 of the weekend, which was Rand Paul.
And then, and look, I mean, we saw Rand Paul do his announcement speech, and then he gave his tour. His tour did not go all that well. There were various moments where he had problems with the press and various other things. Now he's back out on the stump again. Let's take a look at that, and I'll tell you why I think why it mattered.
So often we pick politicians who all look alike, they all sound alike, they all dress alike, and guess what? Nothing ever changes. Government gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we ask ourselves, we have a decision now. We need to find someone who is going to represent us, someone who's going to be the leader of the Republican Party and make the country a better place. How are we going to get that? Some in our party say, well, let's just dilute the message. Let's become Democrat light, and then we'll get more votes. I couldn't disagree more. I think what we need to do is be boldly for what we are for.
Tom, I want to ask you about Rand Paul. He gave that speech up there, rapturous, thunderous standing ovation at the end. Do you think Rand Paul is a for real candidate in New Hampshire?
I think he's a for real candidate, and I think he'll be competitive in New Hampshire. His biggest concern in New Hampshire is an odd one. He has to demonstrate to people, first, he's not his father. And the core of support that he starts with comes that which he inherits. But he's different than his father. He has different perspectives, and he has different outlooks. He's got to be able to hold on to that support and grow it as he defines himself better. Sooner or later, he can't be Rand Paul, son of Ron Paul. He's got to be Rand Paul himself. That's a process that's still very much ongoing.
Tom, finally, my last takeaway. We won't play the soundbite because we don't have time. But my takeaway, Jeb Bush, was, to me, clearly the most presidential, very strong performance throughout the weekend, and yet he's not convincing people. So my takeaway is Jeb Bush is going to have to spend a lot of time there, because I don't know that his game is going to get any better than it is now, and he's going to have to win people over, I think, through time rather than elevated performance.
I thought I saw him 3 times in 24 hours. I thought he was terrific each time. The more time he spends on the ground here, the better.
Yep, he's terrific, but not changing minds this weekend. Didn't blow people away as strong as he was.